My name is Callum Dre, Field Medic, UHEN Auxiliary Corps, seconded to the Diplomatic Integration Office 9 months ago when they needed someone who could set a broken bone and also fill out a Form 7C without complaining. I was 29 years old, and as of the crash, the only living human within approximately 600 kilometers in any direction. I took stock slowly. Left arm, functional. Right arm, not. Something in the shoulder dislocated at minimum, possibly fractured. Ribs, 2 or 3 cracked on the left side, which meant breathing was going to be an exercise in patience for the next several weeks. Head, intact, though the ringing in my ears told me the concussion was real. Legs, both working, which was the most important thing out here. The shuttle was gone. Not gone as in destroyed, gone as in gone. Skidded off the ridge and down into the ravine below, taking with it my long-range comm unit, most of my medical supplies, and the 6-month relationship I'd been building with a woman back on Station Orin who was now going to assume I was dead. She wasn't entirely wrong to assume that. I pulled myself upright against a boulder and looked at where I'd landed. Dense forest, deciduous but alien. The leaves were too large, shaped like cupped hands, and they were a deep bruised purple at the edges. The sky above was the particular pale blue-green that told me I was on Varath, or near it. The upper atmosphere here had a manganese tint that the terraforming charts called characteristic. The air smelled alive in a way that process station air never did. I had a survival kit strapped to my chest, miraculously intact, 2 sealed ration packs, a short-blade utility knife, a field medic satchel with maybe a third of its usual inventory. The rest had been in the shuttle, and the clothes on my back. My sidearm was gone. I couldn't remember taking it off, but the holster was empty. What I didn't have, any clear idea where I was relative to the nearest human settlement, which according to my last coordinates had been the trading post at Vel Marak, roughly 200 kilometers south-southwest. 200 kilometers on foot with cracked ribs and a bad shoulder, through territory that the integration briefings had described as administered by the Varrock sovereignty, currently in a period of closed border review. Which was the diplomatic language for humans not welcome. I'd been a field medic long enough to know that the first rule of a bad situation is not to make it worse, so I didn't move immediately. I sat with my back against the boulder, breath through the rib pain in careful measured counts, and thought. The Varrock. I knew them from briefings, from reports, from the kind of careful institutional knowledge that fills in the shape of a thing without ever making it real. Large, physically powerful, matriarchal, with a caste structure built around the Queen's Council. The common term, used casually, not always kindly, was orc, a word that had traveled from old Earth mythology through about a dozen generations of contact with species that vaguely fit the archetype, and landed here on Varath with a people who, from what I understood, found it somewhere between amusing and insulting depending on their mood. Their closed border review had started 18 months ago. Before that, there had been limited integration agreements, joint resource surveys, some medical exchange programs that my own department had helped coordinate. Then the ambassador incident. I didn't know the details, nobody at my level did, and the border closed. Integration office personnel were recalled. The agreements were suspended. I was, in other words, exactly the kind of thing the Varrock had decided they didn't want on their land. My shoulder disagreed with most of my available options. I bound the arm against my chest as tightly as I could manage one-handed, and with my teeth, drank half of 1 ration pack's water allotment to clear my head and began moving, downhill. Toward water, which was the first rule, and then toward any sign of settlement, which was the second rule, and then I'd figure out the third rule when I got there. I found the river before dark, a wide, cold river running fast over smooth stones, with a bank of dark red clay on my side and dense forest on the other. I drank. I cleaned the cut above my ear, which had been bleeding slow and steady, and which I'd been ignoring because there wasn't much I could do about it in motion. I sat on the clay bank and felt the day's adrenaline drain out of me all at once, and I was just very tired in the way you get when your body has used up everything it had. I heard them before I saw them. Footsteps, multiple sets, heavy but precise, not careless. The footsteps of people who knew exactly where they were walking and chose each placement deliberately. I counted at least 4, maybe 6. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, and running with a dislocated shoulder and cracked ribs is just a fast way to fall. I stood up from the riverbank, turned to face the tree line, and waited. They came out of the forest in a line. 6 of them. Varrock, all female, which was consistent with what I knew about their military structure, mixed gender in the lower labor castes, predominantly female in the warrior and administrative tiers. They were tall, the shortest of them a head above me, with the characteristic pale green-gray skin and the strong forward-set jaw that was distinctive to the species. Their armor was worked leather and dark metal, shaped to fit bodies that were built on a different structural logic than a human body, wider through the shoulders, longer in the torso, with a lower center of gravity that made them look, even standing still, like they were prepared for something. They had weapons, spears primarily with short blades at their belts. The spears were pointed at me. I raised my good arm. The injured one stayed bound to my chest, which I hoped read as injury rather than concealment. "I'm not armed," I said, which was true. I crashed. My shuttle, there was a ridge. I stopped, because they hadn't moved and I couldn't tell if they understood me. The integration briefing said most Varrock in border regions had working standard, but most wasn't all. One of them spoke. Her voice was low and measured, and she was speaking to the woman beside her, not to me. A command or an assessment, I couldn't tell which. The woman beside her nodded and stepped forward, and I noticed she was carrying something I hadn't seen at first, a short staff with a carved end, which in the briefings had been identified as an indicator of rank in the Varrock hierarchy. Not the highest rank, but not the lowest either. She looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to classify, and haven't yet decided where it goes. "Human," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "Crashed the shuttle." I pointed vaguely toward the ridge. "I lost my calm. I'm not a threat. I'm a medic." A long pause. Her eyes moved over me with careful attention, the bound arm, the dried blood above my ear, the survival kit on my chest. Whatever she was calculating, she took her time with it. "Come," she said finally. It was not an invitation. Part 2, the Queen's Settlement. They walked me for 2 hours through the forest, and I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, and not showing how much the ribs hurt every time the trail dipped or turned. The women who escorted me didn't speak to me. They spoke to each other occasionally, in the low, rapid syllables of their own language, and once one of them said something that made 2 of the others exhale through their noses in a sound I interpreted as something between amusement and contempt. I didn't take it personally. A human crashed in closed border territory, bound arm and bleeding head, trying to keep up with 6 warrior caste Varrock. I'd have had opinions about that too. The settlement appeared without warning, the way settlements in dense forest do. You're in the trees and then suddenly you're not, and there it is. It was larger than I expected. The briefings had suggested semi-nomadic encampments, but this was more permanent than that. Structures built from the same dark wood as the forest around it, shaped with real craft, with carved doorframes and reinforced foundations. Firelight in the spaces between buildings. The smell of food cooking, something with a mineral sharpness that made my empty stomach notice it. People stopped to look at me. Not with hostility, exactly, with the specific attention of a community that doesn't see many strangers and has learned to assess them quickly. Children disappeared behind adults. Warriors adjusted their postures. An elderly woman with a carved staff much larger than my escorts leaned in a doorframe and watched me pass with eyes that reminded me of a diagnostic system running a scan, thorough, unhurried, storing everything. They brought me to a building larger than the others. The entrance was flanked by carvings I didn't have the cultural knowledge to interpret, but which had the feeling of significance. My escort stopped outside. The woman with the staff said, "You will be respectful." "Yes," I said. "You will not speak unless you are asked." "Yes." "You will not move quickly." "That's going to be easy," I said, because it was true, and because I was tired enough that it came out before I could catch it. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth too early for warmth, but perhaps a slight recalibration. She turned and went inside, and after a moment the others moved me forward. I'd read the briefings. I knew the Varrock system was matriarchal, that the queen was not a hereditary position but an elected one, voted on by a council of caste leaders, serving until the community called a new election or until she died. I knew the current queen of this territory had held the position for 11 years, which the briefings noted as unusually long and attributed to either exceptional leadership or exceptional ruthlessness, depending on the source. What the briefings had not conveyed, because briefings are written by people who take notes from other people who took notes from other people, is what it actually feels like to stand in front of someone who holds the absolute and unquestioned authority of an entire people in her hands, and who is looking at you like you are a problem she is currently deciding whether to solve or set aside. She was seated on a carved chair that was not quite a throne, but had the same architectural purpose. She was older than I'd expected, maybe 50 by human reckoning, though I had no real way to map Varrock aging to human timelines. Her skin had the gray-green tone of her people, but was darker, with a particular quality I'd later learn comes from years of sun and cold exposure in this climate. Her jaw had the strong forward set of the species, but on her it read as specific rather than general, a face that had made a great many decisions and was prepared to make more. Her eyes were dark gold, which I hadn't known was possible for the Varrock, and they moved over me with the same scanning quality as the elder in the doorway, but more deliberate. She spoke, my escort translated, name and purpose. Callum Dre, Field Medic, UHEN Auxiliary, seconded to the Diplomatic Integration Office. My shuttle crashed on the ridge I indicated north this afternoon. I lost my communications equipment. I'm not here by choice. I'm asking for I stopped, because asking was the wrong frame, wasn't it? I'm requesting temporary shelter while my injuries stabilize, and then I'll need to find a way to contact my people. My escort translated, the Queen listened, then she asked a question. She asks whether you were sent here. No, it was an accident. Another question. She asks whether you are a scout. No, I'm a medic. I set bones and I fill out forms. The translation carried over. Something in the Queen's expression shifted, not softened exactly, but became more specific. She said something short. She says she will decide in the morning what is to be done with you. Tonight you are given shelter and food. You will not leave the structure you are assigned. You will not attempt to signal or communicate with the outside. Understood, I said. The Queen looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said one more thing, in a tone I couldn't read. My escort translated, with what seemed like slight reluctance. She says your shoulder needs to be set. She says she has seen people try to walk with dislocations for 3 days, and it does not improve their character. I laughed. I hadn't meant to. It was the exhaustion and the pain and the sheer unexpectedness of it. And for a moment I was afraid I'd offended everyone in the room. But the Queen's eyes held a quality I couldn't quite name, and she turned away to speak to someone else, and my escort gestured me toward the door. They set my shoulder in a side room off the main building, which meant they had a space designated for that purpose, which meant injuries were expected and planned for, which told me more about how this community functioned than any briefing had. The woman who did it was matter-of-fact in the way that real competence always is. She examined the joint without sentiment, told me through my escort to look at the far wall and breathe, and then reset it in one motion that was so fast and precisely calibrated that I had time to feel the wrongness of it become rightness before the pain fully registered. "Good technique," I said. She gave me a look that suggested she was not seeking my assessment of her technique, but had registered that I knew what I was talking about. She bound the arm in a way that was slightly different from mine, better, actually, accounting for how the specific injury pattern would load the joint during rest, and said something to my escort. She asks if you want something for the pain. "What do you have?" A brief exchange. "The root that numbs, she says it will make you slow." "Then no, I'd rather stay sharp." I paused. "Tell her thank you." The translation happened. The healer gave a minimal nod and left, and my escort brought me to a small structure at the edge of the settlement. Not a cell, not exactly, but clearly a space where people were put when they were present but not fully admitted, a liminal room for those whose status was undecided. It had a sleeping mat, a covered lamp, a bowl of water, and a plate of food that I ate without being able to identify most of it, but which was warm and filling and real. I lay on the mat and looked at the ceiling of the structure, which was dark wood fitted together so precisely there wasn't a gap in it, and I thought, I'm alive. The shoulder is back in. The ribs will hold if I'm careful. In the morning the queen will decide. I was asleep before I finished the thought. Part 3, 7 Days of Watching. In the morning the queen did not decide. My escort, whose name I eventually learned was Vreth, and whose rank translated roughly as Senior Warrant Officer or First Blade, depending on how you map the terms, told me the Queen had matters of greater urgency and would address my situation when she had time. I was given food. I was permitted to sit outside the structure during daylight hours. I was watched. That was the first day. On the second day, a child appeared at the edge of my permitted area and stared at me. She was perhaps 7 years old by appearance, with the light gray-green coloring of the young Varrock and wide eyes that assessed me with complete unself-consciousness. After about 10 minutes of mutual staring, she said something. "She wants to know if your arm hurts," Vreth said from her post nearby. "Not much anymore," I said. "Tell her the healer fixed it." The child received this information and processed it, then said something else. "She wants to know if all humans have faces like yours." I looked at Vreth. "What's wrong with my face?" The translation happened. The child answered with evident authority. "She says it looks like someone forgot to finish it." I laughed again, genuinely, not politely. "Tell her I've been told that before." The child, apparently satisfied with this response, went away. Vreth watched her go with an expression I was beginning to learn to read. It wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite approval, but was in the neighborhood of both. On the third day I was sitting outside when I saw the healer, whose name was Morath. I'd gathered, crossed the settlement toward a structure at the far end with a carrying case that had the particular organized weight distribution of a medical kit. She moved with purpose, and then she stopped and turned back the way she'd come, and I could see from the shift in her posture that something wasn't where it should be. I stood up, Vreth. She turned. "Is there a patient?" A pause. "Why do you ask?" "Morath's kit is short something, she just realized it." I indicated with my good arm. "She's going back for it." But it looked like she was going urgently before, which means the patient probably needs to be seen sooner rather than later. Vreth looked at Morath, who had indeed reversed course and was moving quickly back toward the main building. "I have supplies," I said. "What's left of my field kit? It's in the room." I met Vreth's eyes. "I'm a medic. I'm not asking to wander around. I'm saying if there's something I can help with, I can help with it." Vreth was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You'll come with me." The patient was a young warrior, maybe 18, who had taken a bad cut along the forearm during a training exercise. It was deep enough that Morath's initial treatment, which had been appropriate, had not quite controlled the bleeding, and the young warrior was now running a low-grade fever from the early stages of infection. Morath assessed my field kit with the same detached professionalism she'd brought to my shoulder. She took two things: a broad-spectrum antiseptic compound, human formulation, but with chemical properties that were largely cross-species, and a pressurized wound seal applicator, which she examined with evident curiosity before using it with perfect accuracy on the first application. She did not ask for my help, but she worked beside me, or near me, and at one point she held the arm at an angle and looked at me with a question she didn't bother to speak out loud, and I provided what she was angling for without needing it put into words. Afterward she said something to Vreth. "She says you're not useless," Vreth told me. "I'll take it," I said. I noticed the Queen standing in the doorway of the structure as we came out. She had not been there when we went in. She watched Morath with the quality of attention of someone who trusts the judgment of a person they are watching and is waiting to see what that judgment will be. Then she looked at me for a moment, that same careful scanning look, and walked away. On the fourth day, Vreth's area of restriction for me expanded by approximately 30 meters. I started learning words. This was partly practical. I needed to be able to understand what was happening around me without waiting for Vreth every time, and partly because I am the kind of person who can't stop myself from trying to understand the system I'm inside. Language is a system. Every system has logic. Vreth tolerated my attempts with a patience that I came to realize was not patience in the resigned sense, but patience in the paying attention sense. She corrected my pronunciation without ceremony, and provided words when I pointed at things, which is the oldest and least elegant method of language acquisition, but which works. On the sixth day, the child, whose name was Keth, and who seemed to have decided I was a phenomenon worth monitoring, sat beside me while I was eating and began telling me things in rapid Varrock, watching my face to see how much I understood. It was maybe 30% on a good sentence. Keth seemed to find this ratio acceptable and adjusted her vocabulary accordingly, speaking in the shorter constructions that were within my range. She told me about the river, about the fish in it, about a type of purple-leaved tree that she said tasted like chalk when you chewed the bark, a fact she had apparently verified personally. She told me the carvings on the Queen's doorframe were the names of all the queens who had held this territory. She told me the Queen's name, which was Vareth Cole, the Cole indicating a specific standing in the naming structure that Keth tried to explain, and which I grasped only imperfectly, but which seemed to mean something like, "who persists." I filed all of this carefully, the way I file everything, not for any strategic purpose, but because details matter and you never know which one will be the hinge point of something. On the seventh evening, Vreth came to the structure at a time that wasn't the usual check-in and said, "The Queen will see you tomorrow." "To decide," I said. "To decide," Vreth confirmed. I looked at her. We had spent 7 days in a particular kind of proximity, not friendship, not trust exactly, but the close attention of two people who are watching each other carefully and learning things. "What do you think she'll decide?" Vreth was quiet for a moment. "I think she has already decided. Tomorrow is when she tells you." Part 4, what she actually said. The room was the same. The carved chair, the dark gold eyes, the sense of all authority converging on one person who carries it without apparent effort. There were more people present this time. The elder I'd seen in the doorway on the first night, Morath, 2 other women whose standing I didn't know, and Vreth at her usual position. Keth was visible through the doorway, which she had positioned herself adjacent to with entirely transparent intentionality. The Queen either hadn't noticed or didn't object. Vareth Cole spoke. Vreth translated, but I found I was following more of the original than I would have a week ago. She says, "You came into this territory without permission. The border is closed. The reason it is closed is not something you need to understand. What you need to understand is that we are a people who were promised things by the integration authorities and were not given them, and we have decided we do not need the integration authorities at this time. I nodded. I didn't offer commentary because it wasn't invited and because she was right. She says, "You have been here 7 days. In those days, you gave your medical supplies without being asked and without bargaining. You learned words without being told to. You did not attempt to signal. You did not attempt to leave. You asked Vreth for nothing except the one question about the patient." A pause. She says Morath tells her the wound seal formula has an application for a bone condition that affects 2 of our elders. She wants to know if you can compound more of it from materials available here. I thought carefully. Some of the component compounds, maybe. It depends what's available. I'd need to look. The translation, a response. She asks, if you compounded it, would you want something in return? This was the hinge. I knew it was the hinge while it was happening. I'm a medic, I said. I don't trade in medicine. If I can make it and it helps people, then I make it. That's what I'm here for. I paused. I'm aware that's not an answer to your political situation. I'm not claiming it is, but it's my answer to that question. A silence while Vreth translated. I watched the Queen's face and found it, for the first time, genuinely unreadable. Not because she was hiding something, but because she was thinking, actually thinking, and the process was internal in a way that didn't surface. Then she said something short. She says, Vreth told me, in a tone I hadn't quite heard from her before, that you will be permitted to stay until you have made the compound and your ribs have healed enough to travel. She says you are not a guest because a guest implies a welcome that has not yet been extended. You are a presence that has been assessed and temporarily accepted. A pause. She says, do not mistake this for trust. Trust is earned over time and with evidence. You have 7 days of evidence. You need more. I nodded. Then the Queen said something else, something brief, and the tone of it was different from everything that had come before. A slight shift in register that I didn't have the language for yet, but which felt like a door opening a crack. Vreth looked at me. She also says, the child has been asking her every morning for 6 days whether you are going to be sent away. She says this is irrelevant to her decision, but she thought you should know. Part 5, Evidence. Weeks. Weeks became the unit of measurement. I worked with Morath every day. At first with Vreth translating every 3rd sentence, and then less and less, until we were operating in a mixture of Varrock and Standard, and the improvised shorthand that develops between 2 people who are doing the same work together. She was an extraordinary healer. Her anatomical knowledge of the Varrock physiology was detailed and precise, and she had developed techniques for trauma management that I had not encountered, and which I found myself wanting to document, though I didn't have anything to document them on except memory. I told her so, one afternoon while we were compounding the 3rd batch of bone compound. We'd worked out a local material substitution that produced about 80% of the original formula's efficacy, which Morath had deemed acceptable, and then modified through 3 iterations until it was 93%. She said in the mixing of languages we developed, write it, in your head. You will leave and carry it out. What if I forget something? You won't, she said, with the confidence of someone who has accurately assessed another person's memory. Then, I will also remember. For here. That was, I think, the moment I understood that what was happening between us was a kind of exchange, not transactional, not diplomatic, but the organic exchange that happens when 2 people who are competent at the same thing encounter each other and recognize the competence. It doesn't require liking. It doesn't require trust, exactly. It requires a specific kind of respect that sits underneath both. The bone compound helped the 2 elders. Not dramatically, it was a degenerative condition, and what we'd made was a management protocol, not a cure. But one of the elders told Morath she was sleeping without waking from pain for the first time in 2 years, and Moreth told me this in a tone that was as close to satisfaction as I'd heard from her. I was expanding my range within the settlement gradually, not by pushing, but by being where it was useful to be and letting the community calibrate to my presence. People who had watched me with guarded attention in the first week began to acknowledge me with the kind of minimal nod that means I have assessed you and found you non-threatening, and I don't have more to say about it than that. Keth brought her friends, eventually, a rotating group of children who had decided I was an acceptable subject of study. I learned to tell them apart by their questions. One always asked about human technology, one always asked about food, and one, the smallest, who rarely spoke at all, liked to sit near me in silence, which I came to understand was a particular kind of Varrock expression of ease. Vreth remained my point of contact with the Queen, but the nature of that contact changed as the weeks passed. In the beginning, she was translating and escorting and monitoring. By the fourth week, she was also occasionally sitting near me in the evenings, and we had conversations that were not about logistics. She told me about the border closure, not the political details, not the ambassador incident, but the emotional texture of it. The way the integration promises had built something like hope in the community, and then the withdrawal had taken it away, and how a people who have had hope taken away from them become people who are very careful about what they allow to mean something. The Queen was part of the council that voted for integration, Vreth told me. She believed it would work. And then it didn't. And then it didn't. A pause. She doesn't blame your people specifically. She blames the situation. She says situations create what people do, not the other way around. Another pause longer. She says this about you also, that you didn't choose to be here, that you did what your situation required. She is watching to see if what you do when the situation changes is consistent with what you did when you had no choice. I sat with that. She sounds like a very perceptive person, I said. She is, Vreth said. It makes her difficult sometimes. She sees things people would prefer she didn't see. What does she see about me? Vreth was quiet for a moment. She says you are a person who is most himself when he is working. She says when you are not working you become careful, and carefulness is not the same as your nature. That landed somewhere uncomfortable, the way accurate observations do. She's right, I said. She usually is, Vreth said. It was not said with reverence but with the particular affection of someone who has spent a long time near the truth of another person. Part 6, The Storm and After. 6 weeks in, a storm came down from the northern ridge system that was unlike anything I'd seen on Varath or anywhere else. A 3-day convergence of 2 weather fronts that brought sustained winds and a driving rain that flooded the lower areas of the settlement and damaged 4 structures along the northern perimeter. I spent all 3 days working because there was work to do. The flooding brought injuries, not dramatic ones, but the persistent accumulating kind. Hypothermia in the elderly, infected cuts from debris, a broken wrist from someone whose footing had gone on wet clay. Moreth and I worked from her space, and when her space was needed for patients we worked from mine, and when mine was full we worked from wherever we were. On the second day, Vareth Cole appeared in the doorway of the treatment space, soaked through, which was the first time I'd seen her looking other than composed, and said something to Morath in rapid Varrock. Moreth answered, the Queen nodded and left. What did she ask? I said. If you were sleeping, Moreth said. I told her no. Why did she ask? Morath gave me a look that suggested the answer was self-evident, and she wasn't going to explain it. On the third day, when the rain finally stopped and the light came back pale and clean over a settlement that was wet and battered but intact, the Queen came to where I was resetting a tent post that had been pulled loose by the wind. This was unusual. She didn't typically come to me. I came to her through Vreth when there was reason to. She was wearing work clothes rather than the formal layers she usually carried, which gave her a different quality, not diminished, but more specific. more present. She looked at the tent post, then at my work on it, then at me. She said something short. I had enough Varrock by now to catch most of it. I looked at her and said, in careful Varrock, I understand most of that. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, a slight widening of the eyes, a brief reassessment. She said, your Varrock is bad. Yes, I said, in Varrock, it's getting less bad. Less bad is not good. No, but it is better than more bad. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in standard, you have been learning this whole time. Yes. Why did you not say so earlier? Because earlier I didn't know enough to have a real conversation. I didn't want to show you a partial thing. Partial things are misleading. She studied me. That is a careful answer. You told me to be careful. I told you not to move quickly, she said. That's different. I thought about it. Is it? Another silence. The settlement moved around us, people beginning the work of assessing and repairing, the ordinary purposeful activity of a community that has been through something hard and is now getting on with things. Callum Dre, she said. It was the first time she had used my name directly. Yes, I said. Why did you not try to make me trust you? The question landed carefully, the way her questions always did, not an attack, just a precise probe at something she wanted to understand. Because trust isn't made, I said. It either exists or it doesn't based on what someone has actually seen. Anything else is performance, and performance is detectable. She looked at me for a long moment. Most humans who have come here have tried to perform. They try to show us things they think we want to see. I know, I said. The briefings say the integration attempts had problems with that. The briefing, she said, in a tone that was dry and precise, have significant gaps. Yes, I said, I've noticed. Something happened in her face then, the least performative thing I'd ever seen on another person's face. Not a smile, exactly. Closer to the expression of someone who has been holding something at a careful distance for a long time and has just let it be a little closer. Brief. Real. The compound is finished, she said, returning to practical ground. Your ribs will be healed in another 2 weeks. After that, you should be able to travel. Yes, I said. I will have a guide take you to the southern border. From there, you can reach Velmarak in 4 days on foot. That's yes, thank you. She started to leave, then she stopped. When you return to your integration office, she said, without turning around, they will ask you what you learned here. Yes. Tell them we don't need to be convinced. We need to be treated as if our judgment about our own lives is worth something. When that changes, the conversation can change. She walked away. I watched her go, and I thought about what Vreth had said. She is watching to see if what you do when the situation changes is consistent with what you did when you had no choice. I thought the situation had changed, or was changing, and I still wasn't sure what I was doing in response to it. Only that whatever it was, I wanted it to be consistent. Part 7, the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a strange amount of time. Long enough to feel like duration, short enough to make duration feel insufficient. Moreth and I finished the documentation of her wound management techniques, verbally, in our shared language that was now fluent enough for precision. She was meticulous. She made me go through every step 3 times, which I understood was not because she doubted my memory, but because she was checking her own transmission. She wanted the knowledge to arrive intact. She gave me, on the second to last day, a small carved case containing a dried sample of the local material we'd used in the compound substitution. For your own healers, she said, to analyze properly. The compounds are better than what you brought. Your chemistry is sometimes too refined. That's very diplomatic, I said. It's accurate, she said. Keth found me on the last afternoon sitting at the riverbank. Vreth had extended my range entirely, at some point, so that the whole settlement and its surrounding paths were available to me, and sat beside me in the particular companionable silence she developed as her preferred mode of being near me. After a while she said in Varrock carefully, "Will you come back?" "I don't know," I said. "That's not something I decide." "Who decides?" "Complicated systems of people, politics, the situation." She thought about this. "The Queen says situations create what people do." "Yes. She's right about that." "Then make the situation create you coming back," Keth said, with the absolute logic of a 7-year-old who has not yet been introduced to the concept of structural constraint. I laughed. "I'll try," I said. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." She seemed to accept this. We sat there a while longer, watching the river, and then she said, "You still look like someone forgot to finish your face." "I'm aware," I said. Vreth came for me in the early morning of the 15th day. The guide, whose name was Orit, was a quiet woman who moved through the forest with a precision that made me feel loud and approximate by comparison. She would take me to the border and then return. The understanding was clear. I said goodbye to Morath in the way we developed for our conversations. A direct exchange of eyes, a shared nod that carried the weight of everything we hadn't put into words because it didn't need to be in words. I said goodbye to Keth, who gave me a carved piece of river stone that she said would mean I had to come back to return it. I put it in my coat pocket. I said goodbye to Vreth last. She had been my first point of contact, my translator, my monitor, my eventual interlocutor, and at some point in the weeks that had passed, she had become something I didn't have an easy word for, a person who knew how I worked and had continued to watch me anyway. "Tell the Queen," I said. "Tell her I'm taking the message seriously." Vreth nodded. "Then she knows." "She has been watching." The walk to the southern border took 4 days with Orit, who pointed out things of interest along the way without commentary. A formation of stone that caught the morning light in a particular way. A tree that had grown around an old boundary marker so completely that the marker was invisible from the outside. A stretch of river where the water ran over iron deposits and came out the color of amber. On the morning of the 4th day, I crossed the border marker and turned to find Orit already walking back, without ceremony, returning to her territory. I stood at the border for a while. The forest was the same on both sides, the same dark wood, the same purple-edged leaves. The boundary existed because people had decided it existed, which is true of most important things. I took out the carved river stone and looked at it. Smooth, dark, with a thin vein of something pale running through it in a diagonal line. Keth had probably been carrying it for a while before she gave it to me, wearing down the edges. I put it back in my pocket and started walking toward Velmarek. Epilogue: what I wrote in the report. I got the kind of reception you'd expect for someone who'd been missing for 8 weeks and turned up on foot from the direction of the closed border territory. A lot of medical checks, a lot of forms, a debrief that started with someone asking me if I'd been compromised, by which they meant psychologically influenced, which made me take a breath and choose my words carefully. My report took a long time to write. Not because I didn't know what to say, I'd been composing it in my head since the 4th day of the storm, but because I was trying to write it in a way that was accurate without being usable as intelligence. There's a difference between what a community needs and what an intelligence report should contain, and I navigated that line as carefully as I could. What I wrote in the summary section. The Varrock sovereignty's position on integration is not hostility toward humans as a people. It is a reasoned response to a specific breach of trust in which commitments were made and not honored. Their decision to close the border reflects a judgment that the integration process as structured does not adequately account for their autonomy and the primacy of their own decision-making about their own lives. The path forward, if one exists, is not through persuasion campaigns or diplomatic pressure. It is through consistent, unglamorous evidence of good faith over time, without expectation of return. What I can tell you about the Varrock from 8 weeks in a single settlement: they are a people with deep traditions of practical knowledge, a sophisticated approach to community governance, and a clear-eyed understanding of how trust functions. They will not be charmed. They will not be performed at. They are watching, continuously, to see if what you do when it doesn't matter is consistent with what you do when it does. I left a medical compound formula that will help 2 elderly community members manage a degenerative condition. I brought back documentation of wound management techniques that I believe have applications for multi-species field medicine, and which I recommend the medical division examine. I also brought back a piece of river stone that belongs to a 7-year-old named Keth, which I am obligated to return. My recommendation: do nothing for 18 months. Send no envoys, make no overtures. Let the evidence of 8 weeks settle. Then, if anyone from the integration office returns to that border, send a medic. The report was read by my supervisor, and then by someone above my supervisor, and then, I was told later, by someone in the actual diplomatic apparatus who wrote a marginal note in the margin of my summary section. The note said, "This man spent 8 weeks in closed territory and came back with medical research and a rock." It was meant, I think, as a criticism. I took it as something else entirely. In my desk at the auxiliary office at Station Oran, in the top drawer, there is a small carved river stone with a pale vein running through it at a diagonal. There is also a dried sample of a local Vareth plant compound in a carved case. There is a carved case that smells faintly of resin, and the cold mineral smell of a river I won't forget. I think about a woman who holds her people's authority without apparent weight, and who asked me once why I hadn't tried to make her trust me. I think about what that question says about what she's seen. Everyone who came before me who tried to manufacture the thing rather than simply be whatever they actually were, and let it be assessed. I think about what Vreth said. She is watching to see if what you do when the situation changes is consistent with what you did when you had no choice. The situation changed. I went home, I wrote an honest report, I kept the rock. That's all I know how to do. Be consistent, do the work, let people see what they see. It's not a strategy, it's just who I am. I think, in the end, that might be what she was waiting to find out. And